professora, com a doutora Ana Lembick, né? Ela vai falar sobre neurociência e performance, como os hormônios afetam o comportamento humano. Essa entrevista, pessoal, ela foi gravada e a mediação é com o professor Kleber Candiotto, tá bem? Ele é da PUC Paraná também. Então, ele fez essa mediação, fez as perguntas para ela. A doutora Ana Lembick, que é professora de psiquiatria na Faculdade de Medicina da Universidade de Stanford e chefe da Clínica de Diagnóstico Dual de Medicina de Adição de Stanford. É autora de mais de uma centena de publicações revisadas por pares. É uma líder reconhecida internacionalmente no tratamento e educação em medicina de adição. É autora do best-seller Nação Dopamina, Encontrando Equilíbrio na Era do Excesso, que foi traduzido para 30 idiomas. Então, com vocês, a entrevista da doutora Ana Lembick.
Nossa convidada de hoje é a psiquiatra, professora de psiquiatria da Universidade de Stanford, chefe da Clínica de Diagnóstico Dual de Medicina de Adição de Stanford, reconhecida internacionalmente como líder no tratamento e na educação em medicina de adição. Autora de, vejam só vocês, mais de 100 publicações e do best-seller, né? Nação Dopamina, Encontrando Equilíbrio na Era do Excesso. Olha só, traduzido para 30 idiomas, né, esse seu best-seller. Ela também é professora referência aqui na pós-graduação, tá, chamado Neurociência Aplicada, Produtividade e Performance Humana, da pós-PUC-PR Digital. Bom, gente, eu estou falando aqui, então, da professora doutora Ana Lembick. Professora Ana Lembick, seja muito bem-vinda.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
Baseado no seu livro, então, né, você menciona lá que o prazer e a dor são processados no mesmo local do cérebro. Bom, tendo em vista isso, né, com esse entendimento, então, como que esse entendimento, né, pode ajudar profissionais a poderem equilibrar o estresse e a satisfação, né, para manter uma performance de alto nível, sem cair no nosso grande drama do século XXI, que é o burnout?
Yeah, great question. I think to be able to answer this question, we really have to keep in mind that pleasure and pain work in balance with each other. I sometimes recommend that people actually imagine that in their brain there's something like a central beam on a fulcrum, like a seesaw or a teeter-totter in a kid's playground. And that represents how we process pleasure and pain. When we experience pleasure, it tips one way, pain, it tips the other. And although that's overall an oversimplification, it does get to this very important concept of pleasure and pain being relative to each other, which is to say, very broadly, that if we expose our brains to too much pleasure, so too many reinforcing stimuli in the form of digital media or alcohol or cannabis or stimulants, what can happen is, in order to stay in balance, we can reset our brain's reward pathway to the side of pain as a way to compensate for that. And if we take that too far, we can actually get into the addiction vortex, where now we're kind of chronically tilted to the side of pain to compensate for all that stimulation. And we need to keep using, not to get pleasure, but just to restore kind of a level balance, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. So the ideal is that we have a kind of a supple pleasure-pain balance that allows us to respond to changes in our ever-changing environment, so that we can experience pleasure and we can experience pain, but we don't get stuck in one position or the other. We're able to sort of restore homeostasis, go back to that level position, so that we can continue to be responsive to new information in the environment. Because if there's one thing that's true about our neurotransmitters, the hormones and chemicals in our brain, is that they really evolved for us to be able to evaluate changes in our environment and adapt and make adjustments. So really the sign of health is adaptability. And when we lose the capacity to adapt, we really are at a great disadvantage. And that can happen if we're constantly overstimulating our brains, relentlessly pursuing pleasurable things, even in the form of distraction in digital media, watching too much YouTube, too much TikTok, right? So these kinds of constant brain stimulation is really much more than our brains have the capacity to process. And we end up in this kind of distressed mental state as a result. So when I think about how we can optimize performance in a work setting, I think we really need to begin to appreciate how overstimulated our brains are and really be very thoughtful about allowing our brains to detach from all of the different ways that work grabs us now, especially through this digital medium, and let our brains have a break so that they can restore homeostasis and recharge, restore that level position so that the next day we can go and have sort of a fresh mind to tackle things again.
Muito interessante, né, professor, porque vivemos justamente nesse período, como o seu livro muito bem trata, dos excessos, né, e excessos também no âmbito do prazer que, enfim, estão constantemente ligados à nossa chamada de atenção, ou seja, tirar, né, o nosso foco das coisas que estamos fazendo no nosso entorno para podermos, então, usufruir dessa constante dopamina, né, ou seja, desse constante prazer. E no seu livro, você traz ali uma questão muito importante em termos de uma dica relevante para lidarmos com essa situação, que seria sobre os períodos de jejum de dopamina. Tá? Você poderia nos explicar melhor, né, sobre como realizarmos esses períodos de jejum para melhorar o foco e a concentração, que é fundamental hoje em qualquer atividade profissional. Nós precisamos, por mais que a atividade profissional exija fazermos mais de uma coisa ao mesmo tempo, mas, de certa forma, nós precisamos manter concentração, precisamos manter foco diante de um conjunto de elementos que está nos distraindo o tempo inteiro. Então, você fala ali, e poderia nos explicar melhor essa questão do jejum da dopamina?
So this term dopamine fasting is sort of a colloquial or common parlance way of expressing where we intentionally abstain from our drug of choice, whatever it is, for a period of time long enough to allow our brains to reset reward pathways. So whether our drug of choice is watching TikTok videos or pornography or video games or just scrolling through Instagram, or whether our drug is cigarettes or alcohol or caffeine or opioids, the idea is that we make a plan. It's better if we have a plan going into it to take a break from that substance or behavior for 4 weeks. Why 4 weeks? Because in clinical experience, 4 weeks is about the average time it takes to kind of reset or begin to reset reward pathways and feel better. We need to be very mindful, though, that we're going to feel worse before we feel better. So again, whether we're giving up sugar or video games or romance novels or cigarettes, those first 10 to 14 days are extremely difficult for most of us. What happens, again, getting back to that pleasure-pain balance, is when we take the stimulus away from the pleasure side, we have these neuroadaptation gremlins that have been accumulating on the pain side to try to bring us level again. And when we take our reward away, we really slam down to the pain side and we experience withdrawal. Now, withdrawal is usually the opposite of whatever the initial stimulus did. So if we're using sedatives like Xanax or alcohol or opioids, then when we try to stop, we will feel sedation, the opposite. Oh, sorry, when we try to stop, since those are sedatives, we will feel the opposite. We'll feel restless, anxious, we'll have more muscle movements. Likewise, if we're using stimulants like nicotine, caffeine, methamphetamine, when we try to stop, our withdrawal syndrome will be something more like sedation, right? So the withdrawal is usually the opposite of whatever the drug does. But the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance are actually psychological or psychiatric symptoms. They are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. And what is so interesting is even when we're doing something like just giving up our smartphone for a period of time, even just 24 hours of not touching our digital devices, many of us will experience those symptoms of withdrawal, an awareness that we're feeling restless, a little bit anxious, a little bit out of sorts, that we have intrusive thoughts of wanting to check our phone, even though we committed to not checking it for at least 24 hours. We might even find ourselves automatically reaching for the phone. So this really speaks to the power of this reward pathway to hijack frontal lobe or higher cortical functions outside even of conscious awareness. So there's a great, in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, there's a wonderful description of a man who is trying to abstain from alcohol and in a kind of dissociative state finds himself pulling off the road in his car, parking in the parking lot of the bar that he used to frequent, going into the bar, ordering a drink, and beginning to drink without any conscious awareness of having done so. And this is the hijacked brain. This is the way in which this really quite reflexive instinct to approach pleasure and avoid pain, if we repeat that process enough, we can develop these neural circuits that can fire independent of our choosing to do that, right? So the development of addiction is really, in many ways, the loss of agency. So giving it up for a month or even a day, if it's a digital device, is really a way to explore that phenomenon, whether or not we think it's causing harm. So one of my favorite sayings is the alcoholic who said, well, I never had a problem with drinking until I tried to stop, which is just, a really nice way to encapsulate that we are not very good judges of cause and effect. And we might think that our ingestion of intoxicants or addictive behaviors, potentially addictive behaviors like gambling or video games, pornography, what have you, that we're choosing it. But in fact, when we get into this addiction vortex, we really aren't choosing anymore. It's choosing us. And I think one of the only ways to tell that is to actually get some distance from it, to abstain for long enough to begin to reset reward pathways, knowing that we will feel worse before we feel better. But again, if people can just get through those first 14 days of abstaining, it actually gets much, much easier for most people after that. So, and I think one of the ways that the benefits can manifest in our performance is that we're less depressed, less anxious, we're sleeping better, we're less distracted, but we're also more fully present for the work that we want to do, able to have a continuous thought without distracting or interrupting ourselves as we try to stimulate with our phone or a drink or food or what have you. So I think it just can be a really good exercise to inform us about our habits and whether or not that habit is actually causing harm. Interestingly, if you look at almost any philosophical or religious tradition, there's usually a period of time that's recommended where people abstain from something reinforcing, whether it's Ramadan or Lent, or other traditions of giving something up, either for one day a week or 1 month a year.
Justamente isso, né, que o efeito, né, da dopamina a gente, né, percebe talvez muito mais facilmente em situações de entorpecentes e tudo mais, mas talvez hoje não se percebe tanto por conta da normalidade em relação ao uso da tecnologia. E porque normalmente quando se fala do excesso de tecnologia está mais associado ao problema de falta de foco, de concentração. Aí que vem minha pergunta, então, né? Quais outros impactos, além daquilo que é notório, que é fácil de ser percebido, que é a falta de foco e concentração, mas quais outros impactos o consumo excessivo de tecnologia nos circuitos de dopamina podem afetar negativamente a performance cognitiva e a nossa produtividade em geral?
First of all, we have a lot of empirical data. So empirical data is data based on subjective experience and observation, where we are seeing that the more time that people spend on screens and on digital devices, especially if they're engaging in a consumptive practice where they're passively viewing a kind of digital media, and maybe they're liking it or something like that, but they're not really engaging in a way that's challenging for them or that's adding to content. We clearly see that when people spend too much time doing that, they are more likely to have problems with attention and concentration, problems with anxiety, problems with depression, and problems with sleep. So that's at the sort of empirical case level. But we also have larger scale epidemiologic data showing on a population scale that the more time that people spend consuming digital media, the more likely they are to meet criteria for major depressive disorder or an anxiety disorder or an attention deficit disorder. Now, you could certainly argue that that's correlative and not necessarily causative, right? Because just because there's a correlation between two things, the more time that we spend on digital media, the more likely we are to be depressed, doesn't necessarily explain causality, right? Maybe those folks were depressed first, which then led them to want to engage more with social media. And that's a perfectly valid hypothesis. But the reason that many of us think that it's really causal in the direction of the social media and digital media causing the depression and anxiety and attention is because we have a dose-dependent effect. So the more that time people spend on digital media, the more likely they are to be addicted. And when you have a dose-dependent effect, that's an important indicator of causality. We also have a very important indicator of causality in the sense of experimentation. So when we intervene and have people abstain from their particular digital media of choice for 4 weeks, many times those individuals have vast improvement in their symptoms of anxiety, depression, sleep, and inattention, even without any other intervention to treat those mental health disorders. So that's called experimentation, and it's a great way to test causality, right? If you want to understand how a complex system is working, change one variable in the system and see what happens. We also have published studies showing that if college students even just reduce their use of social media down to 20 or 30 minutes a day, they note improvements in psychological well-being and decreases in anxiety and depression just by reducing their amount. You don't necessarily even need to eliminate it altogether, at least in people who are sort of casual, everyday users. So there really is quite a lot of evidence that's growing, that's showing over-engagement with digital media, especially this kind of passive engagement around entertainment or self-soothing or escapism or auto-stimulation is causing the growing rates of depression, anxiety, inattention, and insomnia.
Muito bacana. Vamos tentar ver, então, o que de positivo a gente pode extrair, né, disso. A minha pergunta, então, agora, mudando o foco do negativo para o positivo, né, seria como a compreensão dos processos dopaminérgicos pode ser usada para desenvolver métodos de aprendizado mais eficazes e também aumentar a retenção de informações em ambientes acadêmicos e profissionais, né? Que, enfim, o nosso também foco aqui na especialização, no nosso curso aqui, que nós, inclusive, aonde a senhora é nossa professora aqui, o nosso foco é trazer também essa contribuição para o nosso estudante aqui, né?
Yeah, so I think that understanding the neuroscience of how we process pleasure and pain, how those deep limbic or emotion structures in the brain interrelate with the prefrontal cortex, how dopamine works. When we understand that, we have a mechanistic framework for appreciating what our behaviors do, how our consumptive behaviors impact our emotional well-being and our performance. And armed with that neuroscience, we can make better informed decisions about how to live in the world differently so that we can really optimize our performance and also feel better, right? Feel more in our lives, feel that we're right where we need to be, doing what we should be doing, more of this kind of FOMO or fear of missing out. We can really get a sense of productivity and wellness that I think, can enhance all aspects of our lives. Because when we're not, in a good emotional or psychological place, it's really hard. We might be able to be productive at work, but it might be productive in a destructive way. We really want to be productive in a way that's enhancing for us, the people we care about, and the world. And I do think that having a deep appreciation for how our brains process pleasure and pain and what happens in our brain as we become addicted can be super helpful for making better informed choices.
Perfeito. Professora, nós estamos já chegando, então, aqui, né, no fim do nosso tempo combinado, né? Mas temos uma pergunta final aqui para fazermos uma conclusão de tudo que nós conversamos aqui hoje e de todos esses conhecimentos que você tem partilhado conosco, seja hoje, seja, né, através dos seus livros também, né? A pergunta, enfim, ela diz respeito a quais são as pesquisas ou tecnologias emergentes que a senhora tem percebido, né, em neurociências, que você acredita que terão um impacto significativo nesta nossa busca de alta performance para equilibrar esse problema do excesso em relação ao uso de dopamina? Consegue mostrar para nós hoje, assim, 2024, o que já está vislumbrando sobre estas possibilidades da neurociência em relação a esse grande desafio que nós temos, né?
Well, the last 75 years, there's really been an explosion in the understanding of dopamine, of the reward circuitry, of appetitive control. And although the science that we have to date is amazing, we're still really just scratching the surface of that. So what I'm very excited about is just the continued work of neuroscientists in that arena and its application to improving our lives and our understanding, which also means that sometimes less is more, right? So we're, instead of looking for like the next new medicine or the next new device, I'm hoping that, and I believe that the neuroscience is showing that really it's refraining from these overconsumptive practices is ultimately what we need to do, not just as individuals, but as communities, to make ourselves feel better and also to save our planet. So I'm hoping that, through this neuroscientific understanding, we might actually stop looking for the next magic pill that's going to take all our problems away, and instead think about how we can create a world within a world so that we're not constantly having to use our willpower to resist the onslaught of invitations to consume.
Muito bem, professora. Quero agradecer imensamente a sua participação, de ter aceitado o convite, estar aqui hoje, né, conosco, de ter proporcionado esse momento de partilha, que foi para nós muito enriquecedor, e deixar, então, para você as últimas palavras, né, desse nosso momento.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really an honor. It's been so gratifying for me that the people of Brazil have been interested in this work.